You're listening to the Outdoors Channel.
Who? What? Yeah!
Woo! I think it's a splendid idea.
Hello and welcome back to the Outdoors Station. Yes, the Outdoors Station. A new name which we've had to adopt due to legal reasons. Over the next few weeks, our website and content will be rebranded, ready for a fresh launch in 2007. You'll find us over at theoutdoorstation.co.uk very soon. So, don't worry, we haven't gone away, we're just rebranding, and we'll be back at full strength very soon. In the meantime, book club host Andy Howell has been holding it all together and been working away with some exciting new interviews. So sit back and enjoy an interview with Martin Wainwright in a coffee shop somewhere in the UK.
Welcome to the second part of my conversation with Martin Wainwright, the Northern editor of The Guardian. During the second part of this conversation, we talk about his new collection of Guardian country diaries, A Gleaming Landscape, which brings together the very best of that column over the last 100 years or so. We also talked about Martin's forthcoming book, On the English Coast to Coast Walk. I hope you enjoyed this conversation every bit as much as we had making it. Now, just when I was really getting over the excitement of this book, imagine my delight when I realised there was a second compilation of the Country Diary coming out, and that's just been released in time for Christmas, and it's called A Gleaming Landscape, 100 Years of the Country Diary, and this takes things on from Harry's diary, doesn't it? Because the Country Diary itself covers almost every aspect of outdoor life throughout the country, and but has been running for 100 years, as you said, and it's a fantastic story, this book. Not just of the countryside and the Country Diary, but actually it's a kind of really good history of the Guardian as well, I thought.
Oh, well, I'm glad you think so, because that part of it appealed to me greatly. I mean, I was a bit worried about this because, as you say, Harry Griffin sold very well, or has sold very well, and so, the Guardian is a commercial organisation. They said, right, off you go and do the whole lot. Well, given that the column started in 1904, when it was called something like a Guardian Country Lover's Diary, and then in 1906, 2 years later, it became the Country Diary. So there's, you can decide whether it's 100 years old or 102 years old. If you compute the fact that it appeared every day from Monday to Saturday, that's more than 30,000 diaries. Well, I can't pretend I've read them all, and you'd go mad if you did, frankly. And Chris Boddington talking about having a decade of Harry Griffin. Well, you could have several centuries of books about the Country Diary if you wanted to, and you could, because they're very good. But again, I didn't just want to do a collection of diaries. I wanted to put in a bit of history as well, and so there's quite a reasonable amount about how the column started and how it's developed and so on. And it is indeed, I think, a fascinating thing. Right from the beginning, the owner of The Guardian, when it was suggested, it's hard to imagine now, but there was a circulation battle going on at the time, as there always is, and C.P. Scott, who's a very, very famous editor of The Guardian, although he's now known as, the man who said, comment is free but facts are sacred and so on, he was also a down-to-earth journalist, and he was having to fight all the time and think of new ideas. And they had this fantastic circulation-boosting idea of a column on bicycling, which was a big new thing. And then they had one on automobiles, as they were called. So those were two things that were introduced to try to shore up the circulation, which had been slightly hit by the fact that The Guardian opposed the Boer War, and that's a damage to circulation. So the third thing they came up with was, what about a few nature notes from the countryside? And there's a letter in the Guardian archive from John Edward Taylor, the man who owned the Guardian, saying, this won't last. They'll run out of things to write about by October. I think it was March when C.P. Scott suggested it. Well, far from running out of things to write about, they are going strong, and there's a queue of people who want to do the job.
Oh, I can believe that. I mean, these days there's a tradition of The Guardian employing many writers for the Country Diary, and people writing a column every couple of weeks or so. But in the early days, it was one man, wasn't it, who held on to the job despite many attempts to try and diversify the style.
Yes. Well, it's very funny. The first guy they got to do it was this man called Thomas Coward, who is a very famous writer about birds in Britain, and who published really the first proper guide to British birds. So ornithologists and bird people will, I think, know all about Thomas Coward. And he was a retired bleacher, textile bleacher. So he got going and doing it. And then, as you say, after about 10 years, his diary was very good, and it was very idiosyncratic. It was quite short compared to today's diary, which is now about 350 words. Coward's was quite often as short as 150 words, and it quite often had little bits at the end saying, which were addressed to individual readers, saying something like, CH, I don't think it can possibly have been a tawny owl, or, Mr. E of Wigan, the albatross is not found at Stockport, or that, little individual messages to people who'd written to him. But by about 1910, C.P. Scott was sending letters to him saying, have you, I think possibly it might be quite good to have a different viewpoint every now and then. Very modest compared to, a modern editor might say, right, off you go, we'll have someone else. And as you say, Thomas Coward, there are letters from him in the archive saying, I would find the loss of half a guinea a week, or whatever it was, or I think 15 shillings or something, which he would lose from dropping just one of his 6 entries. Very difficult to bear, and Mrs. Coward isn't at all well. and he fought, although Coward lived until about 1931, he fought a successful campaign, and he was only finally forced to share the column in, I think, 1913, something like that, just before the First World War.
There's that lovely comment, isn't it, that when he's finally made to give up some of the column, he has to confess that actually it's a bit of a relief, because there's such much hard work in it. And one of the things that comes through from all the diary pieces is just how beautifully crafted they are. I mean, these are fantastic pieces of writing, and the great thing for this kind of book is that they're short, so you can just dip in and out of them just endlessly, really.
Well, that's quite true, and some very distinguished people have done them. I mean, John Masefield, the poet laureate in his day, nearly did them. I know that sounds a bit like, it's slightly sort of cheating, but he was on the Guardian staff at the time, and he was going to do them, but a literary critic called Basil de Selincourt took his place instead. There was an extraordinary cast of people, especially round about that time. There was a suffragette, a very prominent suffragette called Helena Swanwick, whose brother was the painter Walter Sickert, and he's notorious because he's one of the top candidates for being Jack the Ripper. I've no idea if he was or not, but he's one of the suspects. And through Helena Swanwick, whose diaries actually, I was hoping, being a leading suffragette, they'd be very fierce, her diaries, but they weren't. They were mostly about, making jam and the sort of something Harry Griffin would have enjoyed women doing. She put C.P. Scott onto a woman called Car Cox, who was a leading Easthete and Bloomsbury Circle member who had a baby by Rupert Brooke, although sadly it was stillborn. And this woman, Car Cox, she married a leading government advisor called Arnold Foster. She became Catherine Arnold Foster, and her husband, William Arnold Foster, was another country diarist who was employed to do it. And the reason his wife, Catherine Car Cox, got to do it was that he was so busy advising Ramsay MacDonald's government that he sort of said, there's another letter extant in the archives to C.P. Scott saying, I'm afraid I'm much too busy to do the diary this month, so I've asked my wife to do it. Which, wouldn't go down well today. But hers were actually better than his.
I mean, that does reflect something about the diary, doesn't it? That it kind of has a life of its own, and you kind of get the feeling that it works to its own rules. And Robitaille, the editor, that plays with it too much. But it's had its ups and downs. I mean, for a while it appeared towards the back of the newspaper, although now the current editor has brought it back to its right and proper place of prominence, absolutely in the middle of the newspaper. But it's fascinating that the way the diary just seems to work by its own rules.
Oh yeah, no, it's had a lot of ups and downs. I mean, there's a case of plagiarism, which is again in all the documentations there. A diarist who was a bit lazy and more or less sort of copied out or wrote something very, very close to an article that was in a National Farmers Union magazine, and the farmer who'd written the piece, it was drawn to his attention, as they say. And he complained, but in a very nice way, and Guardian apologised, and the diarist apologised, and the farmer sort of said, well, that's fine, but if you do it again, can I have half the fee? Because, as you know, we farmers are up against it. This was quite a long time ago, so things don't change there. And another time, they lost the diary. It was just in the early days of electronic typesetting, and the duty diarist had sent in their country diary, and it had been electronically input, and then it had got, in those days, if you pressed the delete button, little panel didn't come up saying, are you sure? That was it. And Jeanette Page, who was editing it at the time, said, she was down in the composing room, sort of saying, what are we going to do? We must have a country diary. And there's a very nice printer called Peter Postens, and he'd just been telling her and some of the other guys down there about a fishing expedition he'd just had on the Thames. He was a great fisherman, and he'd come across mink, nasty, nasty things, vicious things, and he'd seen this mink attack and kill I can't remember what it was now, a duckling or a moorhen or something like that. And Jeanette said, Peter, you couldn't just do 250 words, could you, on this? And he did. He was a printer, he wasn't a journalist, but he wrote this great little diary which they used. And then there was a follow-up to this, because I got hold of him, and he's retired now, lives in Dorset, and I rang him to ask him about this, and he said, oh yeah, I did 12 altogether. They used me as a kind of long stop. And he said the funny thing was that I would write these diaries, and sometimes they wouldn't get used for months. And so the situation used to arise where they'd come up to him if he was working in the print room and say, Peter, we're going to use your diary tonight, but you wrote it back in June and it's now December, so could you put in a bit of snow or ice or whatever?
And there are two of these in the diary, aren't there? There's the original one that was used at the villa, and then there's a really interesting one about a manic swan attacking him on the Thames, I think.
Yes, and that's true. I mean, it's very interesting. There are so many examples of fascinating wildlife behaviour in both these books. All kinds of animals there's a big controversy about whether lice curl up when you touch them. And you'd have thought that was something fairly easy to decide, but apparently it doesn't, and it all depends on what kind of louse it is. But I was very interested in the swan episode, because I used to, long ago, when I was a student, I used to row in a sculling boat, which are very, very delicate things, like sort of tiny piece of narrow wood, and it's only kept, you only stay upright by using the two little oars to balance. And I was attacked by a swan, and they really do attack you, and I swiveled the skull round as this thing came in, like a Stuka bomber, and it went straight into the end of the skull, the oar, and they're not as powerful and big as the oars of a rowing aid, like you see in the Oxford and Cambridge boat race. They're much more fragile than that, and the end of the skull, the actual blade, just snapped, and the swan collapsed on the thing, hissing on the water. So when I read the Peter Postens about the maniac swan, I thought, that was one that was true.
And there's a couple of wonderful entries about stoats, which I particularly enjoyed.
Yeah, this is the dance of the stoats, isn't it? And the way they're supposed to mesmerise their victims. Well, I was interested in that because one of the things I've put in this book, I mean, mostly it's chronological, but there are instances where I've run 2 or 3 diaries together, because over a period of 100 years, different diarists have observed the same thing. There's another one about gamekeepers' larders, where gamekeepers hang up the bodies of vermin in a rather gruesome way to scare off other vermin. And I think we've got 3 different accounts of this weird dance of the stoats. The other one that recurred a lot is the great crested grebe, and there's a comment somewhere, I think it's Thomas Coward, or possibly Arnold Boyd, who's another marvellous diarist who wrote in the 1930s from Cheshire. And I think he said at some stage, I'm getting a bit worried that people are going to say this isn't the country diary, it's the great crested grebe diary, because it's the symbolic bird of Cheshire, and it's an amazing bird.
I mean, there is this thing that runs through all the diaries. It runs through Harry's book as well, really, about the danger of country diarists being obsessed with birds. And I'm sure there'll be a lot of bird watchers listening to this, but almost every new diarist seems to be warned, don't talk too much about birds, because it'll just take over and the postbag will be absolutely immense. But there's a lot of fascinating stuff here about birds changing their behaviour and how do they pass it on. So, for example, the reaction of birds in the early days of flying when they were really scared, and yet within 10 years or so they'd accepted planes. And was this hereditary, and was it passed on? I mean, all of that kind of stuff's fascinating, I think.
Yes, it raises really important biological and natural history issues. And as you say, there are 2 different diaries. One describing how an early aeroplane terrified waterfowl that were on one of the Cheshire Meres, which in the early days the Cheshire Meres were where the diarists particularly used to go. And then about 10 years later, birds taking no notice at all. It also applies, there's quite a lot of very interesting wartime diaries, and the behaviour of birds and animals during wartime is studied quite closely. There's stuff from the trenches, about how some of these poor guys who were out there, they included a lot of, really very knowledgeable natural historians, and in what time they had, a lot of them kept notes of the sort of wildlife they saw, both in the trenches, where you'd get a lot of vermin and insects and stuff, and up above, where the birds carried on singing, in spite of... It always interests me. I'm a great firework enthusiast, and I always get slightly upset that some people try to ban fireworks on bonfire night because they say it upsets their pets. Well, I'm sure that's true. I don't deny that, what they're saying, but these diaries interest me because they show how animals subjected to noise will become used to it. That certainly happened during the war. And there are descriptions there of birds and other and mammals and things, just carrying on completely oblivious to bombing and bombardments.
Yeah, I mean, these diaries cover everything from the changing nature of the countryside, beginnings of global warming, but also they touch on the big issues of the day, don't they? They certainly touch on 2 world wars, and contemporary issues as well, and there's fantastic amount of stuff in here.
Yes, they do, and they were first in the field in many ways among journalists on the whole business of the threat to the environment. There was a good description, a feature article was written about the country diaries in the mid-1960s by a man called Geoffrey Morehouse, who's a very distinguished writer now, has done a lot of travel books and so forth. And he described them. It was to mark the fact that their names were going to be put in for the first time. It took more than 60 years for their names to be put in. To begin with, there was nothing at all, and then they started having initials, and finally they put their names in about 1966. And he said they were like scouts on the frontier of the great struggle between nature and us, basically. And they were sending back these reports from the frontier. And I thought that was a very good description, really, because, as you say, the country diaries are very short and very concise, and therefore a bit like, you can imagine some spy on the frontier quickly using a tiny bit of radio time to Morse code a message back to headquarters. And it is like that. And some of the more recent diaries have been very eminent people in that field. A chap called Bill Condry, a marvellous diarist who wrote from mid-Wales, was very early on to the whole business of a global warming and of bad farming practice, and he was instrumental in helping to save something called the National Soil Survey, which Mrs. Thatcher wanted to abolish because she thought it was, a wasteful government department that was just doing nothing. And actually, Bill Condry and others led a campaign to say the National Soil Survey is of absolute paramount importance, to keep a check all the time on the quality of soil in Britain and everywhere in the country. I mean, here in Leeds, there's an area within about a mile and a half of the art gallery where we are at the moment, of grade 1 soil, which is the best possible soil, and it's used as a market garden. And it's thanks to people like Bill Condry that we've still got that, the government keeping an eye on that.
I mean, there's quite a few of his contributions in the diary which are fantastic. There's some other real gems as well. People who didn't strike me at the time when I was reading them, like Enid from the Lake District, who, while Harry was up writing about the high fells, she was down writing about the valleys. But some extraordinary writing there.
Yes, Harry actually said, I think, Harry was quite proprietorial, and he sort of said, I'd take the high ground and Enid does the valleys. Her name's spelt Enid, but apparently you pronounce it Enid, which I think is Welsh. And she was a lovely lady. Everybody was really fond of Enid Wilson because she was so modest, and even the way she began doing the diary was an example of that, because her boys, she had 2 sons, and they'd left school and gone to university, so they weren't at home anymore. So she was a little bit at a loose end, and they were reading The Guardian one day, she and her husband. They lived under Blencathra, just between Keswick, on the road to Penrith from Keswick. And he was looking at the country diary, and he said, Enid, you could do this. And she read it every day, and she sort of said, no, I don't think I could. And he said, well, have a go. So she did. And she sent, it was about the same time Harry Griffin started, which was at the beginning of the 1950s. And Wadsworth was the editor then. And she sent off a couple of specimen things, and he liked them. And she, when they had a sort of do in her honour many years later, in the late 1970s, I think, she made a little speech, and she said, well, I just sort of carried on. And I mean, I know from my experience with The Guardian, I remember when I joined it years ago from the London Evening Standard, where whenever you did an article in the Evening Standard, if you were out and about, you always had to ring in and check that they got it. And I always remember the culture change at The Guardian, that you sent in your article and that was it. Nobody ever checked, nobody ever said anything, but more often than not it would appear the next day, silently and mysteriously. It's changed a bit now. Things are slightly more modern now. But I think Enid Wilson had that sort of, she never knew how long it was going to go on for, and with her it went on until she died. She must have done the Country Diary for about 35 years, and she only missed 2, I think, through ill health.
Now, one of the nice things about reading the Country Diary are some of the more recent contributions, because you realise actually there's a tremendous amount of life and vitality left in the diary yet, and actually some stunning contemporary writers writing for it. For example, Jim Perrin, who many of the listeners will know from his columns in TGO magazine and his books, and my guess is it's probably set fair for another couple of 100 years.
I'm sure it is. We launched the second book, the Gleaming Landscape, the one that covers the 100 years of the Country Diary. We launched it on the summit of Cadair Idris in Wales. We launched Harry Griffin's on the summit of Helvellyn, so we've got into a bit of a high-level launch, which can be slightly tiring. But we had a great time on Cadair Idris, and 6 diarists came along, including Jim, who is, I think, almost the doyen of mountain writing. And another diarist, Mark Cocker, is, in a way, the kind of Thomas Coward of today, as far as birds are concerned. So we're getting first-rate people. I mean, they don't want, if anybody's interested in doing the Country Diary, get your name down, because it's not like an elite thing. They're not looking for big names. It just happens to be the case that they've got a couple of very well-known and distinguished writers in those 2. Yes, so get your name down, because all sorts of people express an interest. Because when there was a great diarist called Pete Bowler, who did South Yorkshire until sadly he died of cancer about 3 years ago, and Pete was marvellous, because people maybe think South Yorkshire, they think Sheffield, Barnsley, Rotherham, Doncaster, Pitts, Steel, filth, and it's not. I mean, there's some of the most lovely secret landscapes in Britain in that part of the world. Anyway, after Pete died, I got a letter in my capacity as Northern editor from Dennis McShane, who at the time was Minister for Europe, saying, is there a vacancy? And he was interested in doing it. And he hasn't, as it happened. I think he's too busy.
I don't think that should be allowed, really.
No, he's a good writer, is old Dennis. I suspect he might sort of put in occasionally, vote McShane in Rotherham, but they could always cut that out.
A bit too New Labour, probably, for Harry, but there you go. So, anyway, there's a lot of life left in the Country Diary, and A Gleaming Landscape is a fantastic book. I was trying to remember this morning some of the best bits of it, but actually very difficult, because there are so many best bits. But you do get that wonderful sense of enthusiasm, like when they are all called down to London for the big meet and famous lunch, when some of them got really excited by seeing some rare plants on the intro into King's Cross, and were much more desperate about dashing out to recognise them.
Yes, that's quite right. And that was Ted Ellis, who was another marvellous diarist, and he did East Anglia, where I think he owned a small piece of fenland, and he wrote a lot about that. He's interesting, Ted, because he's commemorated by a type of beer that you can buy. Ted Ellis beer, one of the breweries in East Anglia, produces a range of specials, and they did one in his honour. And that's another interesting little sort of subsection of this whole story. Quite a lot of the diarists have had things or places named after them. Thomas Coward and Arnold Boyd have both got bird hides and reed beds on the Cheshire Meres named after them. Old Harry Griffin was interesting, because before he died there was a suggestion that a tarn should be named after him, and privately I think he was rather pleased about this, until he discovered the one they had in mind, which is some awful... I mean, most tarns in the Lake District have been named, so there's not very many available, and they discovered some boggy little patch at the top of Wyburn, I think. It's Green Up Edge, where you come over from Borrowdale and then go down to Grasmere. It's a notorious place for getting lost in fog and mist. And so Harry wrote a diary saying, I don't think it's a good idea to have a tarn named after you while you're alive. And he couldn't resist adding, and this is a pretty miserable little tarn anyway. But yeah, no, it'll definitely carry on for another 100 years. I mean, the current editor, Alan Rusbridger, is very keen on it. And as you say, although the Guardian nowadays is kind of cool paper, as it were. I mean, lots of young people in London buy it, and it's very trendy and up to the minute. But it was him who, when the paper was redesigned in its current size, the new Guardian, Berliner Guardian, it was Alan who decided to bring the Country Diary back to the editorial page, which is a very precious space. There's not much room on that page. And because I occasionally write leading articles, I was there in London when they were discussing this page, because it has the leading articles on. It has letters and it has corrections and so on. And he unveiled his dummy, see, and I spotted the country diary, and I said, "Oh, I know someone will be pleased," meaning Harry Griffin, who by this time was on a cloud with a harp. And Alan Rusbridger said, "Well, that makes two of us," because obviously the hard-bitten journos, in the high command had said, you don't want this rubbish here. But he's the wiser of them, because it's enormously popular.
Well, I certainly know that it's the first thing that I turn to now when I read The Guardian, other than scouring for news about Aston Villa, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. But, it's absolutely fantastic, and the books are superb, and I'm sure that those of you listening who are not Guardian readers, if you buy either of these compilations, I bet you buy it more often in the future, so it's probably Alan's policy of bringing it back into the centre. It's probably going to boost circulation, I guess. Now, just before we finish, you're a keen walker yourself, a keen mountain walker, and when I first rang you to talk about this, you were up a hill somewhere in the Lake District. I think you had to go to Cumbria that day, which seemed to be a far better bet than sitting in Birmingham office where I was.
I think I was on Kidsty Pike, because I've always wanted to see the Golden Eagle. There's only one now, and I went up Kidsty Pike from the top of Haweswater, which is a very, if you fancy a Lake District walk, it's a very good one, because you can take your car right. I shouldn't. Well, anyway, it's just very useful. And there's a pub on the way back as well, halfway down the valley. And then you could do a very nice round up, going up Kidsty Pike and down to the Straits of Riggindale, which is where the old Roman road of the High Street comes across a sort of defile, a bit like a sort of road version of Striding Edge. And then there's a ridge whose name just escapes me, but it might be Rough Crag. But anyway, that's where the eagle lives. And I saw it twice. And got a phone call from you. So.
Oh, fantastic. And now you're just about to embark on a new project, or you're embarking on a new project. It's a new book, which I know is going to be of great interest to a lot of people that listen to this podcast. Sounds fascinating.
Well, it comes out in February. I finished it, actually, I'm pleased to say. So they're doing the processing of it now, and it's a guide to the coast-to-coast walk. It's in the Aurum, the people who published the two Country Diary books. They also do a series, which walkers will probably know, on national trails and long-distance paths. And they asked me to do the coast-to-coast walk, and possibly because my name's Wainwright, I'm not actually a relation of Alfred Wainwright, at least not, within many generations, but maybe they were sort of thought people would, think I was, sell more copies that way. But I loved it. I just loved it. If you haven't done the coast-to-coast, it's one of the finest long-distance walks in the country, and I say that not because it's necessarily all a mighty challenge. It is quite a major undertaking if you do the whole thing in one go. You need to allow, I would say, at least a fortnight, although there are sort of SAS people who've done it in 48 hours, but I would say allow a fortnight and you'll have a couple of days off. But it's such a subtle walk. It starts from St Bees on the Cumbrian coast, near to the Sellafield Power Station, and it makes its way across through 3 national parks, the Lake District, the Yorkshire Dales and the North York Moors, to Robin Hood's Bay, a famous, very pretty place on the North Sea, on the Yorkshire coast. But in between these kind of famous highlights of the lakes and Swaledale and the North York Moors, there are fascinating other bits. There's the bit between St Bees and the lakes, which is the old industrial rim of Cumbria. There's a strange, eerie section from Shap, where the motorway, the M6 goes up, to Kirby Stephen, where you go across unfrequented limestone plateau, which is just full of prehistoric remnants, and there isn't much to see, to be honest. Apparently in prehistoric times it was like Manchester, but there's no sign of that now. But the thought that these shadowy figures lived on this wild, unfrequented areas is real, sort of makes the hairs go up on your back. And then between Richmond in North Yorkshire and Mount Grace Priory, there's a fascinating agricultural area. And when Wainwright did it back in the 70s, he had to walk on roads for I think 8 miles on that stretch, and now none of it is on roads, because although the coast-to-coast walk is not a national trail, it isn't a recognised footpath. It's just one man's creation, and it's walked by a lot of people, so it's become a distinct path. The footpath officers, particularly in North Yorkshire and Cumbria, have done a marvellous job of working with farmers, and the farmers, as a result, have benefited. And there's one place where you go. You tend to go along the edges of fields, so you're sort of constantly doing right-angle turns. And there's this hedge, and the farmer's got a little kind of wooden and glass display board, a bit like you find in a village where the parish council notices are, and it's addressed to coast-to-coast walkers and other walkers, saying, I hope you're enjoying this bit. Is there anything else I can do? You might be interested to know that the field you're passing by at the moment is, organic, whatever. Just great. And there's a little notebook with a pen attached, with a biro attached, saying, please leave your comments. And you think when you consider there was a time when the farmer was somebody with a shotgun, who'd say, what you're doing on my land.
Yeah, there's no doubt that walking has had a big impact on rural economies, and just looking at the Country Diary, the occasional posts about things like foot-and-mouth epidemic just actually show you how important they are. I remember going up to Settle, I think the first weekend that the hills were open again a couple of years ago, and I don't think I've ever had such a warmer welcome in my life.
No, and you see, grouse shooting is very interesting because we've had all this great controversy about the right to roam, and sometimes it appears that, it's the people versus, a few aristocrats who insist on shooting birds. But once you get out there and meet them, and the coast-to-coast walk, like the Pennine Way, crosses considerable areas of grouse moor, particularly in the Yorkshire Dales and the North York Moors. And it's just fascinating, you discover that the maintenance of a grouse moor, properly done, I'm not saying they're all saints, but plenty of them are very good country people, is a wonderful, delicate operation where you're not just you are keeping grouse to shoot, because that's the point of it, but in the process you're safeguarding, when it's done properly, all sorts of other species. And I know, there is a controversy over raptors and grouse, and the question of, how many can you allow. But on the whole, nature sorts that out, predators and prey. So I think it's just a good thing altogether, really. But please don't leave litter. I did notice on the path here and there, plastic high-energy drinks, and I thought, well, there's only one sort of person they'll have come from, and I don't mean to sound like a sort of mum and dad, a schoolmaster, but just one person doing that can do a lot of damage.
Yeah, I was walking up Loch Nagar in May with a couple of guys, and we were just staggered by the amount of rubbish. We were walking very early, and so we probably passed the people who dropped this stuff, and they were hill walkers. I was staggered by that. So yeah. Anyway, it's been fantastic talking to you about these books. And the Wainwright book, Coast to Coast book, comes out in...
it comes out in February, and it's just called The Coast to Coast Walk, and it's by M. Wainwright as opposed to A. Wainwright, but maybe people won't notice.
Okay. And do you think we're going to see any more compilations of the Country Diary? Or?
Well, they were talking about doing Country Diary at war, because... it's kind of interesting and unusual. I don't know. I'm not sure. I don't actually edit the Country Diary. It's not my. Celia Locks is the editor of the Country Diary, and I feel a bit that I've kind of done my bit, really. Well, a bit like, I don't know, did you see on telly last night they had the new James Bond? I'm not comparing myself to him, as anybody who could see me would instantly know, but the interviewer there said, well, they've done all the Ian Fleming books, so, where's it going to go now? And he just looked at her for a bit, and then he just said, I don't know. So I'm afraid I don't know. But certainly the material is there.
Yeah. Well, we'll all look forward to that, and let's hope there are some. And I must say that the bits that you put in, the introductions that introduce every section are fabulous writing as well, and just capture the flavour and the spirit of the thing wonderfully. So thanks very much for that.
Actually, there's one other thing. Sorry, you may not just have got it as an option. There are other collections of Guardian Country Diaries done by the authors, and Mark Cocker has just published one called Tiger in the Sand. I can't remember offhand how many of these collections there are, and some of them are, you'd have to get from second-hand bookshops or Amazon out of print, but there's about 10 to a dozen, for a real fanatic, there's about 10 to a dozen collections of Country Diaries if you add in these ones that have been done by the people themselves.
And I'm sure there are some real fanatics who are amongst the best followers of the Guardian Country Diary. Well, we're sitting in the Leeds Art Gallery and Museum, and the staff are beginning to give us funny looks now, because we've been here a long time with just 2 little cups of coffee. Martin, thanks very much for that. I've only got one more thing to say, and that's, would you sign my copy of the books?
I'd love to. Thank you very much. I'm really grateful to you for taking an interest, and I do think people will enjoy them, so thanks very much.
Well, that just about wraps up this two-part special on the Guardian Country Diaries. I've been talking to Martin Wainwright about A Gleaming Landscape, his collection of Guardian Country Diaries. That's published by A Room Press, and that sells for £12.99. In the first part of the conversation, I talked to Martin about A Lifetime of Mountains, and that featured the very best of A. Harry Griffin's Lakeland Diaries. And that's also published by A Room Press and also sells for £12.99. Thanks as always to Bob and Rose Cartwright of the Outdoors Channel, without whom these podcasts could not be possible. I'm Andy Howell, and until next time, take care and happy hiking.
My thanks go to Andy once again for making the book club what it is and go from strength to strength with some really interesting interviews. There'll be much more from him very soon. Until then, this is Bob Cartwright at theoutdoorstation.co.uk. The new name, theoutdoorstation.co.uk, beavering away in the background and trying to keep it all together.